My name's Randall Lynch.
And what is your date of birth?
It's January 24th, 1942.
And where were you born?
I was born at Prairie Grove, the old Elizabeth Hospital.
And this interview is for the Farmington Oral History Project, and we just want to be sure we have your permission to use the interview.
You have my permission to use the interview.
Thank you, Randall. Who are your parents?
Wendell and Geneva Lynch.
And talk to me about, where did you grow up?
Scott, I grew up in Savoy, the big city of Savoy, which is out in the country, so pretty much a little country boy.
And tell me about your siblings, if you had any.
I have one brother, Randall Lynch, who is 3.5 years older than I am.
And what was your family's business?
My family's business was farming. We had the big chicken operation, beef cattle, hogs, pretty much general farming.
So what was your part in the family's business?
My part in the family business was pretty much a general flunky. We'd have to round the chickens up. Back then they were outdoors. You had to round them up of a night, and of course taking care of cattle and pigs, feeding them, taking care of them.
What other jobs did you work besides working on the farm?
Actually, I didn't outside of the farm much. I did a little work in the summer. We would build chicken houses, worked on a crew doing that in the heat, so it's general employment.
How did you end up at Farmington schools?
Well, I was offered a job here. Of course, I started in the first grade at Farmington School, so I went all the way through. And after I got out of college, I worked a little while teaching at Greenland, and I came back to Farmington when I was offered a job there.
How long did you teach at Greenland?
2 years.
So what was Farmington School? What year did you come, and what was the school like when you came to Farmington?
When I came to work at Farmington,
Yes.
I came in 1967. Of course, it was much smaller than it is now. We didn't have as many buildings, but it was consolidated school, of course, with Savoy, where I came from, consolidated with it, as did White Rock and a few others.
What did you teach when you first came? What was your assignment here?
I was an administrative assistant to the superintendent, and I also taught science.
So what would some of your duties be in those days? What would you do?
Well, keeping up with the students, attendance and discipline, of course, teaching in the classroom. Also drove a bus at the start, probably for 7 or 8 years.
What are your earliest memories of the community? What was it like? What do you remember of the town here?
Well, I don't remember much about the town because I never lived here. I came to school and I went home, but it was close knit, I know that. And we had a big vineyard right across from the original school. Hobo Hickman had a bunch of grapes there, which of course we occasionally checked out, but it was a small agricultural area.
Tell me about your teaching career, starting from the beginning until how you your different jobs at the school.
Well, of course, I started out as a teacher, taught science. Then a little later I got into coaching. Of course, when I started, I also ran the summer program, which was coaching all the summer baseball, Pee Wee, Little League, and Babe Ruth all in the same day. Take them on the bus to Mountainburg, try to keep the Pee Wees off the railroad tracks while the older kids were playing ball. And eventually I worked into coaching basketball here. I was the head coach for 2 years. I was also teaching the first year, and the second year I was also principal. And that's a pretty tough combination to try to teach and coach, because you get your practices interrupted with some irate parent, which you have to take time out from your duties. But so after 2 years, I went into teaching and as the principal. Then later I became the assistant superintendent. Also taught a while then before I became full-time, and then later was promoted to superintendent.
What was it like being a teacher and a principal? How did you do both? Tell me some of the stories.
Well, of course, you spend maybe half a day in the classroom, the other half keeping up with the kids, seeing who's absent, who shouldn't be, and supervising teachers. You have to visit a lot of classes so you can evaluate teachers as well. So it's pretty action-packed.
Were you the school's only principal at that time?
No, there was an elementary principal also.
But I mean, at the high school? Were you at the high school?
Well, I was to high school, but then later I went to the middle school when I became assistant superintendent so I could do both. But there were other principals. There was one at the high school then and one at the elementary then.
What are some of the stories you remember as a teacher and as a principal?
Well, one of the big ones is just keeping up with kids. And of course, when I was in school, I was known to sometimes not be where I was supposed to, so I usually knew where to look. You know, so sometimes I would be out in the parking lot when they decided to come back, and they, how did you know? I said, well, I've been there, I've done that. Tracy Elkins particularly was sometimes absent, but kept up with them fairly well.
Talk about being a basketball coach. What all did you coach, boys or girls? And tell me about the teams.
I coached the senior boys, and the first year I had 5 kids who had dropped out of the program the year before. So that was kind of a challenge, but they were good athletes. So we had good teams both years. And I don't know if it was the coach before they didn't like or what, but of course we, as you know, were a football school at the time too. So there was some problem there getting kids out, but the ones I had were good. And they, like I say, they had a good year. They won the district's second year, or the first year, and they were 14-7 the second. Probably the biggest problem was they all played football as well, and Coach Holland, who's a good friend, very successful coach, usually was in the playoffs. And the program carried over after he left so that they still were making playoffs and going deep into them. So I didn't get my players until the other schools had probably played 4 or 5 games at least. But it worked out.
Talk about Coach Hollins and the football team and their success.
Okay. When Coach Holland came here, of course, we had decent teams, but they weren't like he built them up. He seemed to have an affinity for working with kids and had a good relationship with them. They listened to him and did what he said, and he just had a knack for coaching. So he built the program to where it became a centerpiece for the community. And Friday nights everybody came out, and it gave pride in the community, and it's just a great job on his part. I remember one coach who I won't name, at halftime he was down probably 40-0. Well, we had won the toss to start the game and elected to receive, so he was sitting on the bench at halftime with his head down while his kids went off who knows where, but the officials went by and said, well, Coach, it's your option. What do you want to do for the second half? He said, I want to go home. And as I say, I won't name him, but we did have predominating teams then. And he's had players, well, one of his good ones was Danny Absher, who is very successful at Prairie Grove as a coach now. Danny's good people and does a great job for them. But as far as the start of the football program here, when I was a senior, we had our first football team, first high school team, 6-man, which is a totally different game. Every player on the team is eligible as a pass receiver. You have to have a clear pass in the backfield before you can run a play. So our quarterback turned with his back to the center and receive the ball through his legs and would pitch it to a halfback, and then he would throw it back to the quarterback so he could run any play he wanted to, but he had that clear pass in there. So it's a wide open game and interesting, but it was a bunch of basketball players who knew nothing about football. I think we won 6 out of 10, something like that, the first year. And it evolved from there into 11 man, of course, and Coach Holland put them on the map.
What about the rivalry? Who's Farmington's rivalry always been?
Of course, our big rivalry's always been Prairie Grove. It was a friendly one. Got a lot of friends over there. We liked each other, but when we hit the field, we both wanted to win and still do.
Talk about when you moved into administration and became superintendent. What was the school? What year was that, and what was the school like then?
It would have been about '86 because I was superintendent for 9 years and retired in '95. So it was approximately half the size it is now.
What challenges did the school face then?
Well, growth was the big problem then, and staying ahead of growth and keeping enough facilities. And the transportation program was a big challenge when I first came in because we'd been in the habit of buying used buses, which don't hold up well. So getting a schedule where we could get new buses in and take care of transportation. Stressing academics, which I certainly wanted to do, was important, and have a balanced athletic program as well.
Who are some of the people you were from the community you can remember that you've dealt with over the years? Some of the ones that have been real influential.
Well, one big influence on me was one of the teachers, Hazel Penn. When I was in school, she was a great teacher and a big support. Buddy Elkins was a big supporter and board member. Jim Parks was a great board member, as was Gary Weeks. Had a lot of them that came through. Bob Spears was a good supporter, board member and also supporter of the school, as was his son Randy, who was on the board for a while. Jim Hankins was a good board member. And a lot of parents would help with anything we needed any time.
Tell me more about your teachers when you went to school here. You talked about Hazel Penn. Who else was teachers you remember that were?
Well, of course, first grade was Marie Brown. A lot of people had Miss Marie Brown. She was a great teacher. But I had others that I liked very much. Kyle Sumter was a good teacher for us back then. Agnes Blue was a great elementary teacher, as was Virginia Wiley and Mary Alexander. There were many of them that were very good.
When you were a kid growing up out in Savoy and coming to school in Farmington, what would you and your friends do in those days for fun?
Well, of course, we got into athletics at the first opportunity, which back then was 7th grade, but we had good times. We roamed the country with our BB guns like other kids and rode our bicycles and played baseball and did a lot of swimming down at the old swimming hole in Savoy, down at the mill pond.
What did the adults do back in those days for fun?
Well, they did a lot of visiting back and forth. They had card parties and they had potluck dinners, and they had the old community building there at Savoy. They had a lot of activities there.
When you first came to work at Farmington as a teacher, what was the town like, and then how has it changed over the years?
Well, of course, like I've said before, I never lived in the town, but it was much smaller. You didn't have the local businesses like you do now. We had 2 stores probably. But when I came, there might have been 4. Paul Giles had a store. Roland Edna Davis had one. Granny White, they called her, had a store in town, little small grocery stores. Andy Lance Phillips had one directly across from where the old Cardinal drive-in was.
One of the traditions in Farmington that a lot of people, since they don't have a local festival here, one of the things that people come out for regularly is their annual Fireman's Pancake Breakfast.
Mhm.
Did you ever attend that?
I came a time or two, but they did have a festival for a while on the 4th of July when Bobby Carlisle was the mayor here. They had big fireworks displays and food, and of course they still host a lot of softball tournaments in the summer, things like that.
Tell me more about those 4th of July's celebrations when Mayor Carlisle was here.
Okay, of course we had food and games and ball games, and then we had a big fireworks display at dark. I know one of the elementary principals at the time was a good friend with Bobby Carlisle, Jay Howard, and he always helped put on the fireworks display, as did the Lions Club, of which he was a member. But he was not always real graceful, and you'd set the fireworks in these big iron pipes and set them off. Well, he set one off, and as he turned to get away from it, he kicked it over, and that caused a bit of a problem for the crowd, where instead of going up, it went toward them. But it's quite a display, and Bobby did a good job with it.
When you were superintendent and principal, who are some of the kids you remember and teachers you remember that you have memories of?
Well, we had some great teachers. Roy Hummel, of course, you know Roy. He was very good with the kids. He would do anything in the world for them. He's also real active in the county fair at the time. Jeanette Robbins is a great home ec teacher. Tanya McQuistion was a wonderful teacher. So we had a lot of them that did a good job. Beverly Woodward was a business teacher. And they all did a good job and pulled their weight.
Who were some of the students that stand out over the years?
Well, one of the outstanding groups we had was about 75 and 76. Wesley Stevens was a really good student. Bill and Gary Cooper, brothers, were both outstanding. And a lot of the girls were as well. Deborah Dorman and Lisa Stevens at the time, who was Lisa Dorman at the time, or not Dorman, Lisa Stevens at the time. But there were a lot of good ones. Billy Carter played basketball for me and was a good student, and he was one of the hardest working kids I've ever seen as far as practice and all. He never took a day off as far as practice goes, always worked hard. Had to watch him though. Sometimes he might think a teammate wasn't hustling. He might want to give him a knuckle sandwich, and I'd have to kind of watch him a little bit. He was really good.
So tell me more about him. What would he do? He'd make sure the other players didn't slack off?
Mm-hmm. And sometimes he would take it into his own hands to discipline them if they didn't. So I'd have to watch him on that and tell him I'd handle that for it. But he's a great player. Worked hard all the time. Tommy Phillips was a really good basketball player for me.
What years did you coach?
I had the 75 and 76 years.
Let's talk about your retirement. When you finally retired, didn't you come back and drive bus for a while?
Yeah, I kind of got suckered into that. When they went to requiring a CDL license for bus drivers, it was difficult for a lot of the older drivers to get them, and a lot of them just wouldn't do it. So they knew I had a license, which I had for emergencies. I had to break down or needed to take some kids home in bad weather. And so my successor, Michael Gray, and the transportation supervisor asked me if I would help out by doing it until they could find somebody. Well, 19 years later, I decided maybe they weren't looking real hard for somebody else. So that's how long I did that. But I enjoyed it. It was a way of keeping involved with the kids, and I enjoyed dealing with the kids.
Someone has told me a story about a student who asked you, I guess they didn't know that you'd been superintendent, and asked you about, you must have been a really good bus driver for him to name a school after you. Do you remember that?
Yeah, actually what the kid said was, why did they name you after a school? I said, because I'm a really good driver, but she kind of got it backwards a little, but she did ask that.
Why they name you after a school? I like that. What are some more stories you can remember about Farmington? I mean, things that stick out in your mind about the community or the school.
Well, one of my first memories is when I started here in the first grade. That was 1948. We had a primary building, which was the old original school, which was attached to the north end of what is now the administration building, because that portion was the upper elementary. Well, you entered through the upper elementary, and we had this indoor ramp leading up to the old original school, which was set up higher. So I remember thinking how long that ramp looked, because I hadn't seen anything like it. Savoy had a one-room school, which I didn't attend, but I was familiar with. And when you got up there, it had real high ceilings and old milk glass globes hanging. And we had almost 40 kids in first grade with Marie Brown. So I was kind of out of my element, but she organized a rhythm band. All the kids were in the rhythm band. Well, she selected your cousin, Darrell Tucker, as the conductor, which obviously I thought it should have been me, not that I was jealous of his position as a conductor, but he got to wear a white shirt and white pants. And I thought that was pretty neat. Most of the kids had 2 drumsticks they beat together in rhythm, but I was a little higher up than that. I got a tambourine at least, but I didn't get to be the director.
What was school like in those days?
Well, like I say, I was out of my element because I'd never seen anything like it. But I remember seeing the high school basketball team play a game outdoors. They had no gym. Of course, it's in the daytime because they had no lights. It was on a dirt court. Also remember the first year or two I was there when they constructed the old original gym, which we were told to stay away from. And of course, being kids, they had dirt piles and things like that due to the construction, which a good place to play King of the Fort and things like that. Also remember the cafeteria. We had nothing like that at Savoy. The kids down there their lunch would usually consist of vegetables brought in. Each kid would bring a big jar of canned vegetables, whatever their mother had, poured in a big pot, which sat on the back of the wood stove, and they'd have soup for lunch that they served themselves. And so to have a cafeteria we would go to over in the next building and have ladies there prepare our lunch and serve it as we went through the line, that was totally different to me.
What was it like in the later grades?
Well, the later grades, we still had that same cafeteria for most of the years. Of course, we went to the old high school building that burned back in the mid-70s. It's where most of my classes were held, and the cafeteria was in the basement of that. So you hoped when you were eating lunch that you didn't have too many people walking upstairs and sifting the cobwebs down on your tray, but it was good. We enjoyed it.
Coach Holland was telling us about the coaches and some of the players mowing the field and using flour to stripe the fields. I mean, what other examples can you think of as how lean times were in those days for the school?
Well, I can tell you a real lean time in 1960, which when I graduated. As I told you, we had a football team that year, and we also moved into a new building at the semester of my senior year, which was 6 classrooms, a cafetorium, office and restrooms. That was the high school building. But one day we showed up in March for school, and the administration met us out there and said, well, get back on the buses, you're going home, school's out. We're broke, we don't have any money to operate the school. So we got out about 6 weeks early, came back in May on our regular date and graduated. So times were hard then.
So what happened?
Well, some more lean years. Back then, we got away with it. Now, of course, they'd probably consolidate you if you did that, and Farmington was very nearly consolidated with Fayetteville anyway. But I'd say the reason we didn't was George Ledbetter. George was an old school country superintendent, an old Madison County boy, as he always called it, Booger County. Well, he came in, and George was very frugal. He also was old school in that he didn't really need a school board or principals or anything. He tried to run everything. And he probably was just what they needed at the time because he probably saved the school. I've seen George take his shoes off that he wore to school and give them to a kid that didn't have decent shoes. And he might be out, you'd go say, where's Mr. Ledbetter? And the secretary, he's around here somewhere. And you'd find him down the flat of his back in a nice suit with baling wire wiring up tailpipe and muffler on a bus. He loved cigars, he always had one. He'd have that in his mouth, burning holes in his shirt while he was working on the bus. But he saved the school because he was so frugal.
What other stories can you think of besides? So he would give his shoes to kids.
I've seen him do that.
The bus. What else would he do?
Well, he also did some things that would get him in trouble, particularly today. One of his cost-saving measures that he hit upon, he decided the elementary school was using too much toilet paper, so he just took it away. That didn't go over too well. The board ordered him to put it back. He didn't, and eventually that probably was the final straw in him having to leave the school. But he was here several years, and he did save it. He did another thing that you'd want to choke him, but when I was teaching biology, I might have a big test that day. Well, come class time, the girls had come strolling in, but none of the boys. I'd say, where are the senior boys? Oh, Mr. Ledbetter decided to take them golfing today. And of course, some of them made it to the golf course, some of them didn't. A few of them made it back to school, but not too many. But he loved golf. He also was a fisherman. He'd bring crappie in, and while the ladies were trying to serve lunch, he'd take over the deep fryers and he would fry fish and take it around and pass it around to kids. And of course, the ladies didn't like that because it kind of got in their way, but that was just the way he was. He'd do anything in the world for you, though.
What were some other cost-saving measures that he or maybe others did back in the day whenever times were so lean?
Well, of course, utilities is one place you can save a little money, so they just watched the lights, the heat level, and things like that. Something broke, they tried to fix it themselves, had a maintenance man who worked hard at that.
When you were superintendent, what kind of things did you have to do to? I'm sure the finances were a little better shape.
Yeah, they were better then, but there again, you do what you can. We did a lot of insulation, a lot of infilling windows, and computerized thermostats, things like that.
Anything else you can think of?
Not right offhand.
If someone came to you and said, Mr. Lynch, tell me about Farmington and what the community's like, what would you tell them?
Well, it's changed a lot since I was here, so I don't really know what to tell you about that. But back then, it was close-knit, and they might argue among themselves, but don't jump on them because then they'd all turn around and jump on you. So but they were really close knit. A lot of people related to others in the community that people didn't realize, and so it was close knit and friendly.
If someone asks you what's your favorite thing about Farmington, what would you tell them?
The people.